I was 12 when I joined a gang. By 24, I was in prison. I thought I had it all. Money, respect, power. But inside, I felt so empty. Have you ever felt like something was missing, even when you seemed to have everything? You know, growing up in San Gabriel Valley wasn't easy. My family was poor, and my dad, he was always angry. He'd hit us for no reason. I was scared all the time. I didn't know what to do. Then I met these older guys from the gang. They were like, "We got you, little man." For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. But even then, there was this feeling in my gut, like something wasn't right. I started making money, lots of it. People respected me on the streets. I had power. But you know what? That empty feeling just got bigger. By the time I landed in prison at 24, I was lost. I didn't know it then, but my life was about to change in ways I never expected. I thought I hit rock bottom in prison, but that's where I found my lifeline. Have you ever felt so empty inside that even breathing hurts? That was me, until a conversation with my cellmate challenged everything I believed. Prison wasn't what I expected. Sure, there were bars and guards, but the real cage was in my mind. Every morning, I'd wake up with this pressure in my chest. Like, I couldn't breathe. I wanted to die. It was like I was just existing, not really living. My cellmate was this guy, a pastor's kid. At first I thought he was soft, but he had this book with him, the Bible. He started reading it to me and I was like, what's this got to do with me? But we ended up going through it twice, front to back. I remember asking him all these questions. I was skeptical. I didn't get all this talk about repentance and salvation. I'd say stuff like, what if I die without repenting for everything I've done? It was messing with my head. There was this war going on inside me. Part of me wanted to believe what my cellmate was saying, but another part was holding on to my old life. It was like I was being pulled in two directions. The pastor who visited us, he told me something I'll never forget. He said, Johnny, your past doesn't define you. God's grace and forgiveness are available to you. Man, that hit me hard. For the first time in forever, I felt a tiny spark of hope. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. I struggled with the idea that I could be forgiven. I mean, I'd done some bad things, How could anyone, even God, forgive that? My cellmate and I would talk for hours. He'd share stories from the Bible, and I'd tell him about my life on the streets. Sometimes I'd get angry, questioning everything. Other times, I'd feel this weird peace I couldn't explain. I remember one night, lying in my bunk, thinking about my life. All the money I'd made, the respect I had on the streets. It felt so empty now. I realized that even when I thought I had everything, something was always missing. The Bible talks about being born again, and I used to think that was just some religious mumbo-jumbo. But in that cell, I started to understand. It was like I was seeing the world through new eyes. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't suddenly all holy and perfect.
I still had doubts, still got angry, still messed up. But something was different. That emptiness inside me, it was starting to fill up with something I couldn't quite name yet.
I started looking forward to our Bible reading sessions. It was like each page was speaking directly to me, Stories of people who messed up but got second chances. That hit home. My cellmate told me about Jesus, how he hung out with people society rejected, criminals, outcasts, people like me. For the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't too far gone. But here's the thing. Change isn't easy. Some days, I'd feel on top of the world, like I was finally getting it. Other days, I'd fall back into my old ways of thinking. It was a constant battle. I started to see my time in prison differently. Instead of just doing time, I was on a journey to figure out who I really was, beyond the gang member, beyond the the criminal. When those iron doors finally opened, I thought I was free. But sometimes the chains we can't see are the heaviest to bear. What if your dreams come true, but you're too empty to enjoy them? I remember the day I got out of prison. The sun felt different on my skin, you know? I was ready to start over, do things right this time. But old habits, they die hard. Before I knew it, I was back in the game, selling drugs, making bank. I'm talking $30,000, $40,000 a month. That's crazy money, right? I should have been on top of the world. But here's the thing, I wasn't. I was making all this cash, and I felt miserable, empty, like there was this big hole inside me that no amount of money could fill. I'd wake up in the morning, look at all the stuff I had, and think, is this it? Is this all there is? It was like I was just going through the motions, you know? Existing, not living. Then things started getting real dark. I saw some stuff that messed me up bad. One of my friends, he got murdered right in front of me, just like that, gone. And then I got this letter from another friend. He was hurting, man. Next thing I hear, he's taken his own life. It hit me hard. I couldn't shake it off. I kept thinking, what's the point of all this? All the money, all the stuff. It didn't mean anything when people were dying around me. I remember sitting in my room one night, just staring at the wall. I had everything I thought I wanted, but I felt like I had nothing. I started thinking about ending it all. Yeah, I was that low. I thought about my time in prison, all those conversations about God and forgiveness. But out here in the real world, it all seemed so far away, like a dream I had once. You know what kept running through my head? What a pity to die doing 12 years in prison with this emptiness, in this void to die with. Yeah, you have money, but you don't have happiness. That's exactly how I felt. Like I was dying inside, even though I was free.
I'd look in the mirror, and I didn't recognize myself anymore. The guy looking back at me, he wasn't the tough gang member I used to be. He wasn't the guy who thought he had it all figured out in prison. He was just lost. And then
I started wondering if maybe I should have stayed in prison. At least there, I had some kind of purpose, you know. I was learning, changing. Out here, I was right back where I started. Only now I had more money and more problems. Every day felt the same. Wake up, count the money, feel empty, go to sleep, rinse, and repeat. I was trapped in a cycle I couldn't break out of. I'd drive around in my fancy car, wearing expensive clothes. But inside, I felt like that scared kid who joined a gang because he didn't know what else to do. Only now, I didn't even have the gang to fall back on. Sometimes I'd think about my cellmate, the pastor's kid. I wondered what he'd say if he could see me now. Would he be disappointed? Would he still believe I could change? The worst part was, I knew I was letting myself down. All that growth in prison, all those conversations about God and redemption, it felt like I was throwing it all away. But even in my darkest moments, there was this tiny voice in the back of my head. A voice that said, maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for me. That maybe all this emptiness was leading me somewhere. I didn't know it then, but I was at a crossroads. Everything was about to change, and I had no idea what was coming next. Little did I know, my next step would come from someone I'd least expect. How could a mother's request, one that went against everything I thought I knew, become the catalyst for my transformation? I was sitting at home, counting my money like I always did, when my phone rang. It was my mom. Now, you gotta understand, my mom and I, we had a complicated relationship. She was a devout Buddhist, and I was me. A gang member, a drug dealer, everything she didn't want me to be. She said, "Johnny, I want you to come to church with me." I was like, what? Church? Me? I thought she was joking at first, but she was dead serious. I didn't know what to say. I mean,
We were Buddhist, right? Why would she want me to go to a Christian church?
I tried to brush it off, you know? I was like, "Nah, Mom, I'm good. I don't need church." But she wouldn't let it go. She kept asking, and I could hear the hope in her voice. It was weird, man. I hadn't heard her sound like that in years. I remember thinking about all the times I'd disappointed her. All the times I'd seen that look of sadness in her eyes when she looked at me, and here she was, asking me to do this one thing. I couldn't say no, so I agreed. Not because I wanted to go to church, but because I couldn't stand the thought of letting her down again. It was like, for once, I could do something that would make her happy. The day came, and I felt so out of place. I put on my nicest clothes, but I still felt like everyone was staring at me. Like they could see right through me, you know? Like they knew who I really was. We walked into the church, and it was like stepping into another world. The music, the people singing, the way everyone seemed so, I don't know, peaceful. It was nothing like what I was used to. I sat there, feeling uncomfortable, like I didn't belong. But then the pastor started talking. He wasn't what I expected. He didn't look at me like I was some kind of criminal. He just talked. And for some reason, I found myself listening. He started asking questions about sin, not in a judgmental way, but like he was genuinely curious about what we thought. I remember he asked, "What do you think sin is?" And I was like, man, I could write a book about sin. I've done it all. But then he said something that caught me off guard. He said sin wasn't just about doing bad things. It was about not believing in God, that everyone was born a sinner. I'd never thought about it like that before. I found myself leaning forward, really listening. It was like he was speaking directly to me. He talked about Jesus dying for all our sins, past, present, and future. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How could anyone forgive everything I'd done? I felt this war going on inside me. Part of me wanted to believe what he was saying, but another part was holding on tight to my old life, my old beliefs. It was like I was being pulled in two directions. The pastor kept talking, and I kept listening. For the first time in forever, I felt a tiny spark of hope. Like maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the darkness I'd been living in. When the service ended, I didn't know what to think. My mom was smiling like she knew something I didn't. I felt different, but I couldn't explain how. It was like someone had cracked open a door in my mind and light was starting to seep in. As we were leaving, the pastor came up to us. He looked me in the eye and said, "I'm glad you came today, Johnny." It wasn't much, but the way he said it, it was like he could see something in me that I couldn't see myself.
I left that church feeling confused, hopeful, and scared all at the same time. I didn't know it then, but that day was the beginning of something big, something that would change my life forever.
You'd think after years in a gang, nothing could shake me. But what that pastor said next, it hit me like a ton of bricks. How could a few simple words turn my whole world upside down? I remember sitting there in that church, feeling all kinds of uncomfortable. But then the pastor started talking, and something weird happened. I found myself actually listening. He wasn't preaching at us, you know. He was just talking, asking questions, like he really wanted to know what we thought. He asked, "What do you think sin is?" And I was like, man, I could write a book about sin. I've done it all, you know. But then he said something that caught me off guard. He said sin wasn't
Just about doing bad things. It was about not believing in God, that everyone was born a sinner. I'd never thought about it like that before.
It was like he flipped a switch in my brain. All my life, I thought of sin as this list of bad things you do. But he was saying it was more than that. It was this internal thing. Like, even if I'd never done anything wrong in my life, which, let's be real, was far from true, I'd still be a sinner just because I was born. At first, I was like, how is that fair? But then he started talking about Jesus dying for all our sins, past, present, and future. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How could anyone forgive everything I'd done? Everything I might do in the future? I felt this war going on inside me. Part of me wanted to believe what he was saying, but another part was holding on tight to my old life, my old beliefs. It was like I was being pulled in two directions. I wanted to believe that I could be forgiven, but man, I'd done some bad things. How could anyone, even God, forgive all that? The pastor kept talking, and I kept listening. He said something about grace, about how salvation is a gift from God, that we don't have to earn it. That hit me hard. All my life, I'd been trying to earn respect, earn money, earn my place in the world. And here was this guy saying, I didn't have to earn God's love. It was just there, waiting for me to accept it. I remember looking around the church, wondering if anyone else was feeling what I was feeling. This mix of hope and disbelief and, I don't know, something else. Something I couldn't name yet. The pastor said something else that stuck with me. He said, the burden of sin is not placed on believers. Man, that was heavy. All my life, I've been carrying this weight. The weight of all the things I'd done, all the people I'd hurt. And here was this guy saying I could put that weight down, that I didn't have to carry it anymore. I felt something shift inside me. Like for the first time in forever, I could take a deep breath. Like maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the darkness I'd been living in. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. You know, I still had doubts. I still had questions. I mean, how could I just let go of everything I'd been, everything I'd done? It felt too easy, too good to be true. The pastor must have seen the struggle on my face. He looked right at me and said, "You're an imperfect person trying to live perfectly." Man, that hit home. That's exactly what I'd been doing. Trying to be perfect in a messed up world, trying to find meaning in money and power and all that stuff. I felt something inside me start to crack. Like all the walls I'd built up over the years were starting to crumble. For the first time, I felt like maybe I could be honest about who I really was. Not the tough gang member, not the successful drug dealer. Just me. Imperfect, messed up me. The service ended, but my mind was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about everything the pastor had said. About sin, about forgiveness, about grace. It was like someone had opened a door in my mind and light was starting to seep in. I walked out of that church feeling like I could conquer the world, but turns out the world wasn't done with me yet. Have you ever tried to change your entire life overnight? Let me tell you, it's not as simple as flipping a switch. I thought I had it all figured out after that first church visit. I was ready to leave my old life behind, you know? But man, it's not that easy. The gang, the money, the lifestyle. It was all I knew. How do you just walk away from that? I remember sitting in my room, staring at all the stuff I'd bought with drug money. Designer clothes, fancy watches, stacks of cash. It was like they were mocking me, reminding me of who I used to be. I wanted to throw it all away, but something held me back. It was like I had one foot in my old life and one foot in this new world I was trying to step into. The pastor, he kept checking in on me. He'd call or drop by, always with a word of encouragement. He'd say stuff like, "Johnny, just focus on living a life filled with hope." But hope, man, that felt like a foreign concept to me. I'd lived so long without it, I didn't even know what it looked like. I started trying to share my story with some of my old friends. I thought maybe if they saw how I was changing, they'd want to change too. But it didn't go down like that at all. They looked at me like I was crazy. One of my boys, he straight up laughed in my face. "You, a church boy now?" "Yeah, right," he said. That hurt, you know? It was like they couldn't see the real me anymore. But the thing is, I couldn't blame them. If someone had come to me a few months ago talking about God and change, I probably would have reacted the same way. It made me realize how big of a change I was trying to make. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about my whole world, my whole identity. I kept going to church, kept talking to the pastor. Slowly, things started to shift. I found myself having different conversations with my friends. Instead of talking about our next score or who we needed to watch out for, we started talking about how we were feeling. Like, really feeling, deep down. I remember one night, sitting with a couple of my boys. We were just chilling, and I don't know how it happened, but we started talking about how empty we felt. It was like, for the first time, we were being real with each other. No tough guy act, no pretending. Just us, admitting that we were lost. That's when I started to see that maybe I wasn't the only one feeling this way. Maybe all of us, in our own ways, were looking for something more. It opened up a whole new way of talking to my friends. Instead of trying to force my new beliefs on them, I just shared how I was feeling, how I was struggling, but also how I was finding hope. Some days were harder than others. I'd wake up and the pull of my old life would be so strong. The money, the respect, the familiar routine. It was all right there, waiting for me to come back. But then I'd remember what the pastor said about living a life filled with hope. I'd think about how I felt in that church, like maybe there was something more out there for me. I started to realize that leaving my old life behind wasn't just about changing what I did. It was about changing who I was, how I thought about myself and the world. And man, that's not easy. It's like trying to learn a whole new language while everyone around you is still speaking the old one. But little by little, things started to change. I found myself making different choices. Instead of hanging on the corner, I'd go to church events. Instead of plotting our next move, I'd be reading the Bible. It felt weird at first, like I was playing a role in someone else's life. But slowly, it started to feel more natural. My friends noticed the change. Some of them started asking questions, curious about what was different about me. It wasn't all positive. I lost some friends along the way.
But the ones who stuck around, they started to open up too. We'd have these deep conversations about life, about the future, about what we really wanted.
I remember one day, I was talking to one of my oldest friends. We'd been through everything together. Good times, bad times, you name it. He looked at Mu and said, "Man, I don't know what's happened to you, but you see, I don't know, lighter somehow." That hit me hard. It was like he could see the change in me, even if he didn't fully understand it. You know how they say the sins of the father are visited upon the son? Well, what if the son decides to break that cycle? I was about to confront the source of my anger and resentment, my own father. Could faith give me the strength to face the man I'd spent years trying to forget? My relationship with my dad was complicated, to say the least. Growing up, he was always angry, always drinking. He'd hit us for no reason, and I was scared all the time. It left me with this deep anger that I carried around for years. It's part of what led me to join the gang in the first place. So when the pastor told me I needed to apologize to my dad, I thought he was crazy. I was like, apologize? For what? He's the one who messed up, not me. But the pastor, he had this way of seeing things differently. He said it wasn't about who was right or wrong, but about healing, about letting go of all that anger I'd been carrying around. I didn't want to do it. Every part of me was screaming to just leave it alone. But something inside me, maybe it was that new faith I was feeling, told me to give it a shot. So I agreed to meet with my dad. I remember standing outside his house, feeling like I was going to throw up. My hands were shaking as I knocked on the door. When he opened it, I barely recognized him. He looked older, smaller somehow. Not the scary guy I remembered from my childhood. We sat down, and at first, neither of us knew what to say. Then, I just started talking. I told him about my life, about the gang, about prison, and then I did something I never thought I'd do. I apologized. Not for everything, but for the pain I'd caused him with my choices. You know what? He started crying. My dad, this tough guy who I'd never seen show any emotion, was sitting there with tears running down his face. And then he did something that shocked me even more. He apologized too, for the drinking, for the abuse, for not being the father I needed. We both just sat there crying and talking. It was like all these years of hurt and anger were just pouring out of us. I told him about the challenges he faced as an immigrant, how I understood it now, how hard that must have been, and he told me how proud he was of the changes I was making in my life. It wasn't easy, you know? There were moments when I wanted to yell, to blame him for everything that had gone wrong in my life. But I kept thinking about what the pastor said about forgiveness, about how it's not just for the other person, but for yourself too. After that day, things started to change between us. We started doing stuff together, like fishing and shooting. It was weird at first, like we were both trying to figure out how to be around each other. But it got easier with time. The pastor, he played a big part in helping me work through all this. He kept reminding me that we're all defined by the sin inside us, not by our actions. That helped me see my dad differently, you know? Not as this monster from my childhood, but as a person who was struggling with his own demons. Looking back, I realize how much that moment of forgiveness changed everything. It was like this weight I'd been carrying around for years just lifted off me. I started to understand what the pastor meant when he talked about the power of God's grace. I remember telling the pastor later, when I followed the word of God above my thoughts, I was able to experience peace, happiness, and reconciliation. And it was true. For the first time in my life, I felt truly at peace, not just with my dad, but with myself too. You know how they say when one door closes, another opens? Well, for me, that new door led right back to prison. But this time I wasn't going in as an inmate. I had a different mission now, one that would test everything I'd learned about faith and forgiveness. I remember sitting in my room one day, thinking about all the guys still locked up. Guys who were just like me not too long ago, angry, hopeless, feeling like they had no way out. And then it hit me. Maybe I could help them. Maybe I could show them there's another way. So I made a decision. I was going to dedicate my life to prison ministry. It wasn't an easy choice, you know? Going back to a place that held so many bad memories. But I felt like this was what I was meant to do. The first time I walked back into a prison as a free man, it was surreal. The sound of those gates closing behind me brought back a flood of memories. But this time I wasn't there to serve time. I was there to serve hope. I started talking to the inmates, sharing my story. At first, some of them looked at me like I was crazy. I mean, here I was, a former gang member, talking about Jesus and hope. But you know what? They started listening. I remember this one guy. He was in for life. He had this look in his eyes, the same look I used to see in the mirror. Just empty, lost. I started talking to him, not preaching, just talking, sharing my story, listening to his. And slowly, I saw something change in his eyes. It was like a tiny spark of hope had been lit. That's when I realized what the pastor meant, when he said my past could be a tool for transformation. These guys, they could relate to me. They knew I'd been where they were, and that made them willing to listen. I started counseling guys who were dealing with depression, loneliness, that feeling of emptiness. I'd tell them, I know how you feel, I've been there, but let me tell you, there's a way out. The key, I learned, wasn't just telling them to stop doing bad things. It was about giving them hope, helping them understand who they really were in Christ. I'd say stuff like, you're not defined by what you've done, you're defined by what Christ did for you. It wasn't always easy. Some days were tough. I'd come across guys who reminded me of my old self, and it would bring up all these old feelings. But then I'd remember what I'd learned about God's grace, and it would give me strength to keep going. You know what's crazy? I started seeing changes in the prisons where I was working. The violence started going down. Guys who used to be at each other's throats were starting to get along. It was like this ripple effect of hope spreading through the place. I remember this one time I was talking to a group of inmates. I told them, I don't tell murderers and ex-convicts to stop doing what they're doing. What I say is, do you know what Jesus did for you? And I saw this look of understanding on their faces. Like for the first time, they were hearing a message of hope instead of condemnation. It hit me then. This was my purpose. This was why I went through everything I did. So I could stand here now and tell these guys, if God can change me, He can change you too. I started thinking of my ministry as creating pillars and vessels out of inmates, helping them become strong in their faith so they could share the message with others. It was like this chain reaction of transformation. Sometimes I'd look around and think about how different my life was now. I'd remember those days when I was strung out, when I thought I'd end up dead or in prison for life. And here I was, using my story to bring hope to others. It was wild, man. But you know what? It felt right for the first time in my life. I felt like I was doing what I was meant to do. Like all the bad stuff in my past had led me to this moment, this purpose. I look back at my life, and it's like I'm seeing two different people. The old me was lost in darkness, trapped in a cycle of violence and emptiness. But now, man, it's like I'm walking to the light. You know, I used to think I had it all. Money, respect, power. But inside, I felt so empty. I remember thinking, how sad would that be? To die with money but without happiness? That's exactly how I was living. But here's the thing, no matter how deep the darkness, there's always a way out. I found mine through faith, through realizing that God's grace is bigger than anything I've done. If you're feeling that emptiness, that void inside, maybe you can give God a shot. Trust me, if He can change someone like me, He can change anyone. It's not about being perfect. It's about finding real peace, real purpose. And let me tell you, that's worth more than all the money in the world.